The genre of Polish art song doesn't begin and certainly doesn't end with Fryderyk Chopin, but his impact on the genre is undeniable. Chopin's Opus 74 contains most of his output of art songs as compiled posthumously by his good friend Julian Fontana. Chopin never composed art songs in any language but Polish, and his dedication to the culture of his home country is evident throughout the collection. This presentation will give an overview of Chopin's Opus 74, its history, its connection to Polish identity, particularly concerning language, and its significance to the genre of Polish art song. I will also be performing 3 selections from this collection. Number 1, Zhichenya, number 9, Melodia, and number 15, Najacani. This chart gives some basic information about the songs of Opus 74 in the order that they were originally placed within the collection. As briefly mentioned earlier, Chopin's good friend, Julian Fontana, posthumously compiled, ordered, and published the collection. Chopin composed each song individually, independent of the others. Because there is no storyline or other obvious connecting elements between its songs, Opus 74 cannot be considered a song cycle, but rather a song collection or song set. It's important to note that this is not the entirety of Chopin's art song output. There are 2 existent songs which Fontana intentionally excluded from his compilation, believing them to be below Chopin's typical standards. For this reason, Opus 74 is sometimes referred to as containing all of Chopin's 19 songs. But this is a false claim. It officially contains only the 17 listed here. Let's take a look at the same chart but ordered by composition date. While at first glance, Fontana's ordering may seem random, a few trends do jump out upon a deeper look. Generally speaking, songs that were written earlier tended to be placed towards the beginning of the collection, and songs that were written later tended to be placed towards the end, although this is a very loose trend. Switching focus to Chopin's compositional trends, he tended to set multiple texts by the same poet in a row. A majority of the texts by Stefan Vidvitsky, as well as all 3 of the texts by Józef Zaleski, were set consecutively. As shown by this line, the 2 approximate halves of Opus 74 were written over 2 distinct time periods. The first 9 songs were written in just 3 years, between 1829 and 1831, while Chopin was still taking lessons on setting the Polish language to music. The last 8 songs were written across 12 years, scattered with irregular amounts of time between them. Let's get to know some of the key players in the creation of Opus 74 and how they related to Chopin. First, as mentioned before, Julian Fontana was the compiler, orderer, and publisher of Opus 74. He and Chopin were close friends in life, and Fontana was an outspoken champion of Chopin's music after his death. Another of Chopin's close friends, Stefan Vidvitsky, was the poet responsible for most of the texts found in Opus 74. He was not as famous as many of his contemporaries, and the fact that he was such close friends with Chopin is in and of itself perhaps his greatest claim to fame. Józef Elsner was Chopin's composition teacher. He was a prolific composer in his own right who is most remembered for his mastery of setting Polish text to music. Adam Mickiewicz and Józef Zaleski were relatively well-known Polish poets of whom Chopin set 2 and 3 texts, respectively. Chopin only set 1 text by Zygmunt Krasiński, but its intrinsic connection to Polish national identity makes it stand out. It is one of the 3 songs I will be covering in depth, so more on that later. Chopin didn't know Krasiński personally, but knew of him through his piano student, Delfina Potocka, who was romantically involved with Krasiński. Chopin set 1 text each of Ludwik Oshinsky and Vincenty Pol, and knew neither of them personally. Both were relatively well-known Polish poets who Chopin would have simply known of through his own artistic circles. George Sand is very much the outlier among these people. She was a French poet with whom Chopin had a contentious, sometimes toxic, on-again, off-again relationship. Her real name is Amandie Dupin, but went by a male pen name to make it easier to have her works published. She is notable not because Chopin set her texts, but because he didn't. To provide some context for the relative notability of these poets, Krasiński, Mickiewicz, and Juliusz Słowacki, who had no relationship to Chopin or Opus 74, are still to this day colloquially considered the three national bards of Poland. Chopin is generally considered to be the first significant Polish art song composer, but he was not the first to conceive of the genre. That's not to say that Polish composers never wrote art songs, but they usually set texts in French or German, not Polish. Ludwig van Beethoven set 2 Polish texts as part of his 23 songs of various nationalities. But not at all being familiar with the Polish language, his treatment of text leaves much to be desired. Had most of his music not been lost, Chopin's teacher, Józef Elsner, would likely be considered the first significant Polish art song composer, not Chopin. He was far more prolific than Chopin and even branched out into the genre of opera. Fortunately for Elsner, he does have one work which has kept his legacy alive, his 1818 treatise on the setting of Polish text to music, the cover of which is pictured on the right side of the screen. This document lays out extensive rules and guidelines for the setting of the Polish language, which are still studied and adhered to by Polish composers to this day. It would not be unfounded to argue that no other person has had more of an impact on the genres of Polish art song and opera than Elsner. It's clear to see why Chopin specifically sought out Elsner as a teacher. This was also indicative of how connected Chopin felt to his native language, and how important it was to him to learn how to set it to music. Unfortunately, very little of Elsner's treatise has been translated into English, but among that which has is this quote, which highlights the significance of the natural rhythm of the Polish language. It is the form of the Polish language which creates the accentuation on the penultimate syllable, because through such a pattern of accentuation, the language distinguishes itself from other Slavic languages. There are multiple reasons for the relative unpopularity of the Polish language among art song composers, even Polish ones. There are many obstacles one must overcome in order to set a Polish text successfully. As described in the Elsner quote, the rigid stress pattern of the Polish language can cause composers to feel trapped by such a limited selection of rhythmic options. Such composers may feel freer when setting a language such as Italian or German, which have more varied stress patterns, or French, which has no stress pattern at all. The Polish language is notorious for its difficult-to-pronounce consonant clusters, the likes of which are found in almost no other language, much less one of European origin. One of the most important points made in Elsner's treatise is about the treatment of these consonant clusters. Singers, even those fluent in Polish, may struggle to pronounce certain clusters in a way that will not disrupt their singing. There are multiple tricks that singers use to circumvent these clusters and make them more manageable to pronounce without losing the meaning of the text. A conscientious composer should be aware of the places in which a singer may want to implement one of these tricks and compose in such a way that the singer can do so with relative ease. Chopin was a master of setting the Polish language in as friendly a way as possible to singers. Here are a couple examples of consonant clusters found in Chopin's songs and how I, as a singer, would implement certain tricks to work around them. This excerpt is from number 2, Wiosna. The consonant cluster in question is highlighted. As originally written, this line would be sung in rhythm as Już zginął w obłoku. To make the consonant cluster a bit easier to pronounce, I would begin to pronounce the letter Z in zginął slightly early, approximately halfway through the 16th note preceding the word. Using this trick, the line would sound like Już zginął w obłoku. This sounds almost exactly the same as originally notated, but it allows for the singer to keep a smoother legato across the phrase without sacrificing any meaning. This trick doesn't have an official name, but I personally refer to it as consonant anticipation. The second excerpt is from number 3, Smutna rzeka, and it contains 2 consonant clusters. Both of these clusters require the use of a different trick than the one I previously discussed. The words gdzie and brzegi both begin with tricky pairs of consonant sounds, but mercifully, the words before each of them both end with a vowel. This allows a singer to implement a trick which, again, has no official name, but which I refer to as consonant shifting. Using consonant shifting, the singer treats the initial consonant of the two highlighted clusters as the final consonant of the word preceding it. So she and dwe become sheg and dwib, while je and bjegi become je and zhegi. When this trick is applied, the full line sounds in rhythm like chi sheg je za pa dwi bjegi. Given all of these inherent challenges in setting the Polish language, why did Chopin exclusively set Polish texts? He was equally fluent in French from a younger age, thanks to his father, and throughout his life, he lived and worked in Paris for long stretches of time. Not to mention that the tradition of French art song, known as Mélodie, was significantly better established. Chopin was even friends with many Mélodie composers, particularly Hector Berlioz, with whom Chopin frequently traded compositional advice. Beyond that, the well of French poetry was far deeper than that of Polish poetry. In particular, it would have been logical for Chopin to have set at least one text by his romantic interest, Amandine Dupin, aka George Sand, but he never did. It was clear that Chopin felt a strong connection to his native language. The fact that he went out of his way to take lessons with Elsner is evidence of this. Of course, we will never know for sure, but it's possible that Chopin wished to pave the way for generations of Polish art song composers to come after him by setting a precedent for setting Polish text, which could encourage future composers not to shy away from the language as many before him did. If this was his goal, he succeeded. While Chopin was only able to muster approximately 20 art songs during his lifetime, great Polish composers who came after him far exceeded that total, particularly Stanisław Moniuszko and Karol Szymanowski, who each composed at least 5 times as many Polish-language songs as Chopin. Now, thus far, there has been one person whose name has been conspicuously absent from this presentation, the composer with whom Chopin is compared more than any other, Franz Liszt. Chopin and Liszt have many similarities which make them an easy target for comparison. For starters, the two composers were born just a year apart from each other. Each was born in an Eastern European country from which they are the most renowned and well-known composer, Chopin in Poland and Liszt in Hungary. Both traveled around Europe throughout their lifetimes. Both composers are primarily known for their piano music, which is the primary focus of most comparisons between them. The national style of each composer's home country is evident in their respective piano works. Here's where we start to see some differences. Both composers wrote art songs, but Liszt wrote almost 4 times as many as Chopin. Why? While Chopin exclusively set Polish texts, Liszt opened himself up to other languages. He does have a few songs in Hungarian, but the vast majority are in either French or German. Overall, Liszt's art songs are more well known. When studying either French Mélodie or German Lieder, his songs are usually mentioned. That being said, it's arguable that Chopin's songs have had more cultural significance. While Liszt was adding to the great, well-established traditions of French and German art song, Chopin was blazing the trail for a relatively obscure genre of art song. This is not at all to say that Liszt didn't value his Hungarian roots, or that Chopin has any sort of moral high ground over Liszt, but simply to make an interesting comparison between two historically similar composers. Let's move on to discussing some of the individual songs of Opus 74, starting with the first song in the collection, Zhichenya. Composed in 1829, this was the first art song that Chopin ever wrote, while he was still taking lessons with Elsner. It is by far his most well-known song, and rather inarguably the most well-known Polish art song by any composer. It was one of only 2 songs which were published during Chopin's lifetime, the other being number 10, Wojak. It is recognizable enough within Poland that almost any Polish adult will know the tune and words, including non-musicians. Because of its heartfelt text, it is a popular song to teach in schools. The writer of the text is Stefan Vidvitsky, who provided most of the text for Opus 74. Chopin chose to set this poem as his first art song because it provided an opportunity to practice many of the rules which he had been learning in his lessons with Elsner. In particular, most of the lines of the poem are 11 syllables long, which is common in Polish poetry, and which, according to Elsner, requires specific treatment of stress different from any other length of line. The first two lines of the image on the screen are a scan of Chopin's initial sketch of Zhichenya. The third and fourth lines are a transcription of that sketch as done by Anne Schwartz in 1989. Let's focus on the very first phrase of the song, which, as previously discussed, is 11 syllables long. Let's zoom in on Schwartz's transcription of this phrase. I've also included a copy of the first phrase of the final published version of Jachenya for the purpose of comparison. Right away, it's obvious that the melody of the sketch is almost completely different from the melody of the final version. However, the rhythm is almost exactly the same. This is evidence of the level to which Chopin valued and followed Elsner's advice. He clearly came up with the meter and rhythm first, and then once he felt he had perfected it, went back to make the melody to his liking. According to Elsner's treatise, the most important aspect of setting an 11-syllable phrase is that the 10th or penultimate syllable be given the most stress of the phrase. These arrows indicate that Chopin obeyed that rule from his first conception of the song to its publication. Here is a translation of the text of Zhichenya. If I were the sun in the sky, I wouldn't shine on anyone but you, not on lakes, nor forests, nor anything else. Oh, I would shine through your window and only on you, if only I could change into the sun. If I were a bird from a forest, I wouldn't sing in any foreign country, not for lakes, nor forests, nor anything else. Oh, I would sing through your window and only for you, if only I could change into a bird. You may or may not have picked up on it, but this line is the title of this presentation. This line encapsulates Chopin's unwillingness to write art songs in any text but Polish. Whether or not he was cognizant of this when writing Zhichenya, we will never know, but it did turn out to be an interesting bit of foreshadowing. Here is my performance of Zhichenya.
Gdybym ja była słoneczkiem na niebie, nie świeciłabym jak tylko dla Ciebie, ani na wody, ani na lazy, ale po wszystkie czasy pod Twym okienkiem i tylko dla Ciebie, gdybym w słoneczko mogła zmienić siebie. Gdybym ja była ptaszką z tego gaju, nie śpiewałabym w żadnym obcym kraju, ani na wody, ani na lazy, ale po wszystkie czasy pod Twym okienkiem i tylko dla Ciebie, czemuż nie mogę ptaszka zmienić siebie.
Moving on to number 9, Melodia. This was the last song Chopin ever wrote, written 28 years after Zhichenya. One of the most distinctive aspects of this song is its use of bent tonality, which is common in Chopin's later works. Melodia begins with a bit of a deception. The piano intro contains a simple phrase played in G major. That phrase is then repeated in F major. When the vocal melody comes in, it establishes the key of the song as E minor. The texture of the first couple phrases of text is sparse, with the piano only playing a few chords beneath the melody in a recitative-like fashion. The key of the song transitions to the parallel major, E major, by the start of the next section. This middle section contains constant quarter note triplets in the right hand of the piano, making it the only part of the song which contains consistent forward motion in the piano. A few measures into the middle section, Chopin uses a respelled and incomplete German augmented sixth chord as a transition chord from E major to A flat major. By the end of the middle section, the key is returned to E minor and the texture of the song switches back to the recitative-like section at the beginning. This final section differentiates itself from the first through its use of rare non-diatonic chords such as sharp 6 diminished, minor Neapolitan 6, and flat 7 half diminished 4/2. After the vocal melody has finished, there's a brief piano outro, which is essentially a repetition of the initial piano intro phrase, but played in E minor. The text of the song is by Zygmunt Krasiński. It is a biblical allegory which represents the oppression of Poland under the Russian Empire. This was a common theme in Polish poetry of this time period, and one which resonated with Chopin and helps to distinguish Melodia from many of the other songs of Opus 74. Since this was Chopin's last song, it's worth asking why Fontana didn't choose to order it last within the set. Melodia was the last song that Fontana added to Opus 74, which means that he had likely already committed to number 17, Śpiew z Mogiły, as the final song. Śpiew z Mogiły is Chopin's longest song, and its theme is similar to that of Melodia, but more explicit. The title translates to Singing from the Grave, but it is most commonly referred to as Poland's Dirge. If Fontana wished that song to be last, it's likely that Melodia's placement as number 9, the exact middle of the collection, was to emphasize it by giving it a centerpiece role. Here is a translation of Krasiński's very abstract but very expressive text. Under the cruel weight of the crosses they bear, they stand on the mountain to see from afar the promised land. Their eyes see the heavenly light, as the people struggle to descend. They see the land they cannot enter, the land they will never live in, and here their bones will lie forgotten, perhaps forever. Here is my performance of Melodia.
Gdzie dźwigali strasznych ciżów brzemię, widzieli z dala obiecaną ziemię. Widzieli światło niebieskich promieni, ku którym w dole czanęło ich plemię. A sami to tych nie wyda przestrzeni. Do godów życie nigdy nie zaszedł. I nawet może zapomnieni.
last song I would like to dive into is number 15, Najacani. This song was written in Paris in 1831. This was while Chopin was towards the end of his lessons with Józef Elsner. The inherent drama of Najacani distinguishes it from the two songs we have discussed thus far. This song is one of the few of Opus 74 which has a coherent and developed storyline. A young man rides home on his horse at night, desperate to see his fiancée, only to learn that she died while he was away, crying out in despair and begging for her to return to life. The rushing, chromatic figures in the piano represent the running of the protagonist's horse and the howling of the wind. This song is strophic with 5 verses and contains fast text, which makes it hard to perform and harder to memorize. The placement of Najacani within Opus 74 is also worth discussing. It's possible that the story of Najacani is a continuation of number 10, Voják. Both texts were written by Stefan Vidvitsky, and both songs were composed while Chopin was studying with Elsner. In Voják, an energetic young man excitedly sings about going off to war. Is it possible that the protagonist of Najacani is the same man, harrowed by the horrors of war? The fact that Voják was not placed directly before Najacani weakens this theory a bit, but it is worth noting that the song that does come before Najacani, number 14, Chen, is sung from the perspective of a woman who is reminiscing about a ring she received from her beloved. It could be that this woman is the one who is dead in Najacani. But the storyline doesn't fit as nicely, as the text of Chen implies that the woman has lost her love due to infidelity, not due to war. Here's a translation of the text of Najacani. The wind howls through the trees. You gallop wildly on. Your black hair streams behind you. But, strange horseman, you ride in vain. Don't you see above the trees how the ravens gather, soaring, cawing, flying, swooping down into the forest? Where are you? Where are you, my darling? Why don't you come out to meet me? How can she run out? She is dead. She lies cold in her grave. I am sick with grief. Let me see her. As she lay dying, did her eyes search for me? When she hears me crying, feels my tears over her grave, maybe she will wake from the dead and live again. This dotted line marks the point at which the perspective of the narrative shifts. Above the line, the song is sung from the perspective of a narrator who speaks directly to the protagonist. But below the line, perspective switches to the protagonist himself. Here is my performance of Najacani.
Jedzie krzewy, nie w czas koniu, nie w czas chłopcze czarnobrewy lecić tu po błoniu, nie w czas chłopcze czarnobrewi lecić tu po błoniu. Widzisz tam nad lazem tego kruków stada, jak podleci krozie czasem i w las znów zapada, jak podleci krozie czasem i w las znów zapada. Gdzie chodzę, czemuś nie wybierzi, jak się wybiec może, kiedy w grobie leży, jak się wybiec może, kiedy w grobie leży. Opuszczajcie żamne tłoci, niech zobaczę żonę, ci konając piękne oczy, zwróci włama stronę. ponajać piękne oczy, zwróciła ma stronę. Gdy usłyszymy wołanie, płacz mu naswa głowa, może strumnie jeszcze wstanie, zacznę żyć na nowo. Może strumnie jeszcze wstanie, zacznę żyć na nowo.
In conclusion, Fryderyk Chopin's Opus 74 Polish songs are proof of Chopin's commitment to the culture of his home country, particularly its language. This collection of songs set a precedent which allowed the genre of Polish art song to flourish after Chopin's time. I'd like to give special acknowledgement to Jarrett Larson for his wonderful piano playing, and to Dr. Andre Mount for his guidance as my faculty collaborator throughout the semester. This would not have been possible without either of you. Thank you to you both, and thank you to everyone for watching. Do widzenia!